Chapter 12. Welcome to the land of Juju. At that time, AIDS had exploded in southern Africa. As I traveled through South Africa and Zimbabwe, death from the disease was everywhere. You could drive by a cemetery and see hundreds of new graves. The infection rate was about 32% of the population. At one time, they sampled the Zimbabwe army and found a 100% infection rate. In all the countries where Sensei had started his style of karate, he appointed a chief instructor. South Africa had two. One was in Cape Town and one was in Johannesburg. They had developed over 100 schools in South Africa with thousands of students. The highest-ranked chief instructors at the time were 6th-degree black belts. The two in South Africa, one in England, and the American chief instructor all shared that rank. After Japan, I was promoted to 5th degree. I've been training for over 30 years. At that time, worldwide, there were less than 10 of us at that rank. Like anything, the higher the fewer. John, the chief instructor for South Africa in Cape Town, picked me up from the airport. I first met John 23 years earlier. I was a green belt at the first karate tournament I ever participated in. Sensei T had invited 3 very famous Japanese teachers and their students to attend. Sensei S was there too. He brought only one student, a South African black belt named John. The Japanese instructors were from New York City. Their students had won some notoriety because of a film they were in about their participation in a huge Japanese tournament. The film was called Fighting Black Knights in Japan. I watched the stars of the movie compete. As a green belt, I was really impressed. These guys were good. At least that's what I thought until the South African guy fought them. John just laid them to waste. They had no answer for his impeccably timed front kick. They couldn't predict his movement. He made beating these guys look easy. So this is the guy that picks me up from the airport in his new 450 Mercedes. It's a beautiful car, white leather interior, white convertible top, white exterior. On the way to his house, he tells me a story. He and his wife were going somewhere, and his wife was behind the wheel. Suddenly, a car pulls from behind them and pulls right in front and starts hitting the brakes, eventually bringing both cars to a stop. The driver, a guy in his 20s, jumps out and goes to the right side of the car where John's wife is sitting. He starts yelling at her about cutting him off. He uses vile language. John gets out of the car, walks around to the road-raging driver, and John asks him to settle down. He apologizes for any slight that his wife may have committed. The other driver is not relenting. He continues to curse at John's wife. John tells him that's enough and he needs to shut up. The driver replies, "F you, old man." To be fair, John was in his early 60s at the time. John said he gave the guy 3 chances to hit him, gave him 3 swings. Then, with his cupped right hand, he smote the guy on the ear. Then he head-butted him, which created a big gash on his forehead. He fell to the ground, concussed, blood running down his face, deaf in one ear. He looked up at John and said, "Are you mad?" John said he felt terrible about it. He got the guy in the backseat of the car, and they headed to the emergency room. His wife was upset about all the blood staining the white leather. They get to the emergency room, and the examining physician starts saying unhelpful things like, "Wow, it's opened up right down your skull, and you're going to need a lot of stitches. And what's that? You want me to talk into your other ear?" On the way to the hospital, John apologized profusely and offered to pay for the medical bill. When the doctor inquired on how this trauma had occurred, John said it was a car accident, and the road rager said nothing. We arrived at his mansion, a beautiful house, swimming pool, hanging gardens, all behind a 12-foot-high wall. On the drive to this house, I saw many armed response signs on people's lawns. It seemed like they lived in their own prisons, big walls, gates, and dogs for security. John was a millionaire. Not only did he have 1,500 karate students, but he had several very successful businesses. I stayed overnight at John's house, and he told me he had arranged for me to stay with one of his students. His name was Ryan, and he was the instructor at one of John's schools. This was in Cape Flats. Apartheid had ended only a few years before this visit. This society had been broken up into categories according to skin tone. Does that sound familiar? In the South African case, you're either black, white, or colored. Ryan's family had been categorized as colored by the old regime. His father was Indonesian, his mother was from southern Italy, so she had an olive complexion. She showed me a picture of her mother, and she looked like a white church grandma from Vermont, but she was classified as colored. Shades of the Australian wogs. Ryan, who was 25 years old, had an older brother and a younger sister still in school. The two younger kids lived with their folks. The two boys had been taking karate under John since they were sprouts. Ryan taught 3 classes a day at the dojo. It was his full-time job. The new South Africa was still evolving. Ryan's parents didn't really see any benefit to them occurring in the new regime. Certainly, whites had their privileges curtailed, and blacks had theirs expanded. Life for the colored in the middle really didn't change at all. Another thing I noticed in the week that I spent with them was that after a meal their plates were spotless. Not a breadcrumb, not a single grain of rice was left. They couldn't have been cleaner if they'd licked them. I believe this is the practice of people who have experienced hunger. John had introduced me to Ryan as Sensei T's senior student. Even though Sensei T had never stepped foot in Africa, all of Sensei S's students around the world knew who he was. Because of this and my rank, I was often asked to teach Sensei T's techniques. These guys spent their time perfecting one hit, one kill. Me too. As a martial artist, you want to control the situation with the least amount of harm. That was Sensei T's philosophy, except if there were 13 of them or if they had a gun. Then, got to beat crap outta. They didn't know any throws, arm bars, wrist locks, chokes, or 100 other techniques that didn't involve punching or kicking. One karate student summed it up when she thanked me for showing her all those hand tricks. I guess that's one way to put it. Ryan was a great tour guide. He took me around all the cool spots in Cape Town. He knew the good restaurants. He knew the good beaches. It was great to have friends to keep you out of trouble. After a week, I headed to Joburg, where Africa's other chief instructor picked me up at the airport. His name was Leo, and he always reminded me of a lion. I hadn't known him nearly as long as John. I first met Leo at the World Championships in Finland. Unlike John, who was tall and well-built, Leo was built like a cinder block and sported quite a belly. By looking at him, you would never figure him for a 6th-degree black belt in anything but cake eating. You would definitely be wrong. He was incredibly fast and powerful. His hit would kill. He was supernaturally elusive. You couldn't find him. Oh, no, I've got him. Where'd he go? Slippery, you know? Before apartheid ended, he taught a number of black students. He left the dojo one evening after class and found 5 men waiting for him. They wanted to know why he was teaching black people karate. They said they were to teach him a lesson. Leo said, "Look, there's 5 of you. There's only 1 of me. Who's your best fighter?" He and I can go around the corner and sort it out. The group all agreed that Ronnie was their best fighter. Ronnie and Leo disappeared around the corner of the building. In less than 10 seconds, Leo reappeared and asked the group, "Well, who's your next best fighter?" Apparently, they didn't have one. I went to Southern Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia 5 times. In some ways, it was like the Old West. A lot of fights, a lot of death, and not a lot of law. I would like to reiterate that I am telling the story of what I witnessed. My tale has no agenda. I was both amazed and incredulous at things I observed and learned as I talked to Africans, both black and white. I stayed with Leo for a week. John, Leo's Cape Town counterpart, taught at his own dojo and oversaw many more. Leo didn't have a dojo, but many of his students did, and he started teaching at them regularly. In his backyard, there was a low cinder block structure that was basically a shed divided into 2 sections. One was dedicated to lawn tools, and the other was a teeny dojo. It was somewhere around 8 foot by 8 foot with cinder block walls on 3 sides. Holding the pad for Leo was always painful. His patented bat kick would lift you off your feet and slam you into the concrete wall 3 feet behind you. Half of his techniques would do the same. I was airborne again. During my time with Leo and his wife, who for some reason he called the Black Dwarf, I noticed extraordinary security precautions. As I said, my impression was that they lived in their own prisons. Their house was surrounded by an 8-foot-high wall with broken glass mounted on the top of it. They came in the house through a locked gate. Even so, they had bars on their windows and doors. Whenever the Black Dwarf went into the backyard, she locked the back door. The back door consisted of 2 doors, a solid wooden door and then a steel barred door that was on the outside. She would leave the interior door open and lock the steel door. After that, she would reach back into the house through the bars to hang the keys on a hook. The hook was not visible from the door. You had to know where they were to retrieve them. I asked her about this. Why do you do this every time you go out back? And she explained that if an intruder came over the wall, he wouldn't be able to get in the house. The door was locked, but she didn't have the keys on her. The new South Africa was only 3 years old. It was a very violent place, and as I said, life was cheap. At the time, the Johannes taxi wars were in full swing. 12-seat passenger vans were common, and apparently they were the most stolen vehicles in the country. Drivers of these vans, these taxis, took people to work and brought them home on a daily basis. Gun battles with AK-47s settled disputes over poached passengers and routes. Drivers and passengers were being slaughtered on a daily basis. A week before my arrival, Leo woke up because he heard voices right outside his bedroom window. The window was open and covered by a thin curtain. 4 men had breached the wall and now stood right outside his window. The window was covered with bars. The bars were on hinges and secured by a padlock. If there was a fire or for some reason you needed to open the window, you could unlock the padlock and swing the bars away from the house. Leo's unwelcome guests had a lock cutter. Leo got out of bed and got his pistol. Home invasions had been plaguing the city, and this had all the earmarks of another one. He got to the window just as he heard the lock snap. He pulled back the curtain and fired twice at the lock cutter less than 2 feet away. The malefactors fled and somehow managed to scale the wall with their injured compatriot. Leo called the police. At the time, it was hit or miss whether they would respond to any call. Since the change in government, the police had been defunded. In some instances, there wasn't gas for the cars. Some police wouldn't respond because they lacked parts for their radios and had no way to call backup. There were many reasons why the police were hamstrung in their ability to keep the peace. Today, South Africa has the 3rd highest crime rate in the world. 1 out of 4 men admit to being rapists. The 800 annual murders in Chicago is nothing compared to Joburg's 30,000. Walking down the street in Johannesburg, you had to keep sharp. My friend DeVette had come to Joburg to train with Leo. I'd met DeVette, who was an instructor in the city of Louis Hart at the World Championships in Switzerland. He and I hit it off, and he invited me to visit whenever I was in the neighborhood. If you taught at a school that was under CNCS, you had to continue to train or you couldn't teach. I was very lucky to be able to train with him, the world chief instructor in New Jersey, on Thursdays. DeVette had the coolest name ever. In Afrikaans, DeVette means the law. That's his first name. His last name means of the regent. So literally, when he introduces himself, he says, "Hi, I'm the law of the regent." And as I got to know him over the years, he was certainly not misnamed. At that time, I was pushing 50, and DeVette was around mid-30s. He was a farmer. He'd been to University for Agriculture, and he and his father operated the farm together. They raised cattle, sheep, chickens, catfish, and plantations of vegetable crops. The next day, DeVette and I left in his bucky, that's Afrikaans for pickup truck, for the 5-hour drive to Louis Hart. DeVette was very proud of his Boer ancestry and told me about his people from the beginning of the Europeans in South Africa. The first Dutchmen to set foot in Cape Town were survivors of the wreck of the New Haarlem in 1647. The New Haarlem was a ship that belonged to the VOC, which was the Dutch East India Company. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, he may have started changes in the world second only to Christ. The age of exploration and colonization began with the spice trade. For the next couple of 100 years, the Portuguese would dominate the spice trade from China to Europe. They did it by capturing a number of ports along the route. Not only did they use these ports for resupplying their fleet, but they also controlled all the trade that came out of these ports. The wealth this generated allowed them to establish 50 colonies around the world. The game was on, and the Dutch, the British, and the French joined the spice rush to Asia. The Dutch East Indian Company was formed in 1602, and they were busy supplanting the Portuguese. The British East India Company was formed 2 years earlier. Both the Dutch and the British would use these refreshment ports to start colonies all over Africa and Asia. For the British, it was the start of their vast empire. At its height, 23% of the world's population, 412 million people, lived under British rule. The empire spanned 13 million square miles, more than twice the size of Russia, a country that spans 11 time zones. Hence the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. All this from a little country a little smaller than Oregon, with a population of 5 million at the time. Back to the New Harlem. It ran aground at Table Bay. The Dutch sailors were able to retrieve the precious spice cargo and bring it to shore. They built a small fort and bartered with the locals for livestock. Shortly after, a Dutch ship came and took half the crew home. The remaining crewmen stayed with the spices until a ship could be sent to carry the New Harlem's cargo back to Holland. At that time, the British used the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, off the west coast of Africa, as their halfway point to India. The French used Saldanha Bay on the coast of Namibia as their resupply point. When the sailors of the New Harlem returned home, they lobbied for their waypoint to be in Cape Town. The VOC complied, and the first Dutch settlement, a Dutch East Indies Company settlement, started 5 years later. The VOC, like its British counterpart, the British East India Company, were chartered companies. They had no competition. At the same time, they carried the force of their governments. Cape Town was a company town whose sole purpose was to supply ships of the spice trade as they went back and forth from India to Holland. The colony started with less than 400 VOC employees. As time went on, other settlers arrived. French Huguenots who had fled their homeland because of religious persecution and had gone to the Netherlands. There was also a number of Freeburgers. They were unattached to the VOC. In America, we would call them pioneers. The Freeburgers would grow crops and livestock to supply the VOC. Some were known as Trekboers, nomadic ranchers. They also developed a distinct identity in the community where individualism, self-sufficiency, and distrust for authority was valued. Those three qualities were still carried in the vet's blood, as you will see. Labor was needed in the Cape Colony, so the VOC brought slaves from the east coast of Africa, Madagascar, India, and Indonesia. Each of these 4 places represented a quarter of the slaves in the Cape Town colony. At one time, there were over 2,000 slaves for the 400 to 500 Dutchmen. They were constantly escaping. Slavery has been going on since the beginning of civilization. 4,000 years ago, there were slaves in the first great city of Sumer. There were slaves in ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome. Slaves were taken by the Vikings and by the native peoples of both South and North America. Oftentimes, slaves were the spoils of war. In times of famine, family members might be sold off. Because Muslims had a prohibition against killing fellow Muslims, during the Ottoman Empire, more than 1 million Christians were taken from Europe and enslaved. Some were the Janissaries, slave soldiers. The Janissaries were pivotal in the capture of Constantinople in 1453, where they served Mehmed the Conqueror. You'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere in the history of the world where a people had not both kept slaves or had been enslaved themselves. Yes, dearly beloved, even the Canadians had slaves. The practice still goes on today. Today, there are a number of countries where slavery is legal. It is said that between 10 and 12 million people were taken in the Atlantic slave trade. That's the population of Moscow or Paris. Yet today, worldwide, there may be as many as 40 million people living in slavery. Just as the Dutch supplanted the Portuguese, the English usurped the Dutch in Cape Town. English settlers by the thousands arrived in Table Bay in 1820. 15 years later, the independence-loving Boers had had enough of the English rule, and the Great Trek began. They started 3 states, the Orange Free State, Natal, and the Transvaal, all in the northeast portion of the country. De Wet's ancestors were Voortrekkers. They took the 400-mile walk to escape British authority. His family settled in the Limpopo region of the Transvaal. Once diamond and gold were found in the country, Britain made plans to take the entire country over. Independence for the Boer was taken away by the English, and at the end of the Boer Wars, it was gone for good. All of South Africa now was a British colony. Today, the Boers are called Afrikaans, but I can tell you they're a whole different breed of cat. When we get to Louis Trehart, De Wet took me to his house and introduced me to his wife. They were both fluent in Afrikaans, English, and the local Venda dialect. De Wet put me in a guest room. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I was jolted awake by the cacophony of a troop of baboons racing across the tin roof to climb an adjacent tree. De Wet started training me on how to survive in this country. Things that can kill you are around every corner. De Wet was always armed. Dangerous animals were everywhere. When De Wet was a kid, his father hired a Kalahari bushman to teach him bushcraft. After school, barefoot, he would go with the bushman. He learned the various signs of the game animals. He learned to track and hunt. He learned to spot the puff adders and cobras hiding in the underbrush. By the time he was a teenager, he made summer money by hunting guinea fowl. He and a friend would stay in the bush for weeks at a time. They would live off the land and would sell their game to the local villagers. His father would come out occasionally to resupply them with ammunition. Consequently, De Wet was very canny in the bush. As a rule, my trips to Africa would last a month or more. I spent quite a time on De Wet's farm, which was segmented into a number of different operations. De Wet employed about 20 of the local Venda people as labor on the farm. They had their own mess hall where they would eat their lunch. De Wet paid them twice as much as any of the other farmers in the area. He had property where he raised sheep and cattle. He had his own feed mill where he produced feed for his livestock as well as for other people in the area. He also had a contract to develop a feed for a crocodile farm. He also had a slaughter and packing area for chickens. This property had a couple of rondavels, the traditional round African huts. This property also doubled as a sales area. He would keep chickens on hand to sell to the local people, and one popular item was called walkie-talkies. They were simply the head and the feet of a chicken. He also had hundreds of acres of land where he grew what he called baby marrows. They were little squashes, pretty much like zucchini. On one piece of land, he raised chickens in buildings he called chicken hawks, as opposed to chicken coops. I believe there were 5 of them, with about 500 birds in each. I guess each building was about 30 by 60. Cinder blocks came up from the ground, maybe 2 feet, and then the rest was screened up to the eaves of the roof. On the floor, there were several inches of wood shavings. He could produce a chicken for market in as little as 35 days. When De Wet approached one of the chicken hawks, he would clap his hands. If any of the birds didn't instinctively duck, De Wet would go on the hawk and kill it. It was a quick and easy way to find birds that were sick. After the hawk was empty, the shavings would be sent to a feed mill where they would be processed into cattle feed. One day, while we were attending to the chickens, a local Venda man pulled up in his pickup truck and asked De Wet for 20 chickens. While De Wet went to attend to the man's order, he and I sat under a shade tree and talked. This was one of my first conversations of any length with a native person. I found it very interesting. He had never met an American, and it seemed that he wanted to give me some insight into his culture. The first thing he said as he gestured toward DeVette as he walked away was, "That guy, I wouldn't kill." I was blown away by the statement. I mean, what about me? Would I get the same courtesy? How do I make the list? I asked him the obvious question. Why not? He said, "Because the guy likes us, he grows food for us." He waved his arm to encompass the chicken farm and said, "This might be my grandfather's land, but I couldn't do this. I couldn't build a farm like this. The white man can think for 3 days. I can only think for 1. He went on to tell me that he drove a truck as his main occupation, but he also salvaged blue plastic barrels, which were everywhere. He was going to sell the chickens at his new house. He said he had to move from his village to a new place to build the house because if his neighbors found out that he was wealthy enough to build a new house, they'd kill him. The way he portrayed it reminded me of crabs. They say you don't need to put a cover on a pail of crabs because if one climbs up trying to escape, the others will pull it back down. In the time I spent in Africa, talking to the Venda and Zulu in South Africa, the Shona, Netabili, Songas, and Botaka in Zimbabwe, I came to realize that they were very spiritual people. There were spirits in everything. Every rock, every tree, every natural thing contained a spirit. Many were evil, perhaps not unlike the Japanese religion of Shinto and its Oni. In the West, I'm sure this would be branded as rampant superstition, but it is unquestioned in Africa. Hence, all information is filtered through this belief system. Their religion contains no joy. If things aren't going well, you go see the witch doctor for a charm, a potion, or a counter curse because obviously some person or spirit has cursed you. I was to come across many bizarre and almost unbelievable beliefs. For example, if you're born white, you're given a checkbook, so you have access to the world's money, plain and simple. Nothing else entered into the equation. Juju, or magic, was present everywhere. When the Voortrekkers left Cape Town to go to the Transvaal, they crossed through Zulu lands. At one point, they made their camp near a Zulu village. The Zulus were quite concerned about these interlopers and went to their witch doctors to do something about it. The witch doctors said that they would curse the whites to death. They could certainly do so with their own people. So the witch doctors worked all night to kill the Europeans in their sleep. The next morning, the trekkers woke undisturbed, went about their business, and left. The people asked the witch doctors for an explanation for their failure. The witch doctors simply replied, "Well, the white man's juju is stronger than ours." That belief exists to this day. I'll tell you stories where juju plays a critical part. There were 2 dojos in town, in Louis Trehart, and I was asked to teach classes in the evening. But mostly I hung out with DeVette and marveled at his industriousness. He built what he called a dam. It was a big metal pool for catfish. If you think of it a big road culvert, the big tubes that go underneath the road, it was made from the same kind of curved steel. It was about 14 feet in diameter and 4 feet high. It contained hundreds of catfish that he fed dog food to. When he fed them, the water would boil. I knew DeVette for many years. I visited him every winter for 5 years, and after that I would see him at the World Championships. I was no longer competing. I retired at the age of 50 after winning the AAU Nationals. I thought going out as the national champion would be a good move, at least for my ego. But I was asked to go to 3 World Championships as a referee for the U.S. I would see DeVette in all these events, and we'd catch up. The guy was always at war, and I mean life or death war. You've got to understand the poverty in Africa. Think about it. The rural people don't even have a light at night. There's no plumbing, there's no water, there's nothing. They live in rondavels, which are constructed with mud and cow manure, with a grass-thatched roof. I heard the reason they're round, so evil spirits can't catch you in a corner. They eat the same thing 3 times a day, every day. In South Africa, it's called pap. In Zimbabwe, millie meal. It's made from corn, or as they say in country, maize meal. It's like a corn cream of wheat or oatmeal, stiff enough to grab with your fingers, which is exactly how it's eaten. You grab a glob out of the pot, and there may or may not be a sauce to dip it in. From there it goes into your mouth, 3 times a day, every day. Meat or vegetables are a treat. They sleep with bricks underneath the feet of their beds. It may not be a brick, but they elevate their beds. This saves them from the tokoloshi that attacks one while you're sleeping. It's a diminutive yet potent evil spirit. The tokoloshi is a universal scapegoat when bad things happen. From rape to murder to you name it, it was the tokoloshi what done it. Because of the local conditions, Devet was often robbed. He had a couple of places where he sold chickens. He had a couple of employees at each. Bandits would show up, threaten, or beat his employees and steal the small amount of money he had in their cash box. Like a mafia don, Devet wasn't going to be let it known that he could be stolen from or there'd be no end to it. Sometimes the employees knew who the bandits were. Sometimes Devet would go to the Venda headman and find out who the thieves were. Once he knew, he would go to their village and beat the crap out of him and anyone else who tried to stop him, which happened more than once. The police were no help. Devet had a reputation for taking care of business. He lives in a violent world, desperate people doing desperate things. This story epitomizes the kind of life he lives. Devet had a water pump enclosed in a small shed. He'd had problems with it and asked his father to swing by to check on it. It just so happened that on the trip to the pump shed, his dad brought his mom. As they approached the shed, they saw 4 men walking toward them. They were armed with pangas, a long-handled machete, and knobkiris, a Zulu war club. Devet's dad parked next to the shed about 30 feet from them. They both got out of the car, and Devet's dad asked the strangers what business they had on the farm. They said nothing, but continued to close on the couple. Devet's father knew predators when he saw them and quickly ushered his wife into the pump shed and locked the door. He called the police as the 4 men outside shouted for them to come out. After contacting the police, he called the vet, who was about 10 minutes away. The door opened inward, so they couldn't kick it in. So they started chopping at it with their pangas in an effort to cut through. Devet's father told him the police were on the way. He could only hope they were, but he knew that Devet certainly was. This only caused the assailants to redouble their efforts. Devet arrived in a cloud of dust. He stepped out of his buggy while it was still moving. He told me he didn't really remember much about the combat. He was concentrating on saving his parents. The 4 men were down in moments, and Devet said he was so enraged that he didn't even realize they were armed with pangas and clubs until it was over. Devet gave his parents the all-clear, and they left the shed, got in their car, and left. Devet proceeded to put the 4 men in the back of his truck to take them to the police department. One still unconscious from a broken skull. Another had a broken leg, apparently from Devet's roundhouse kick. The third had a broken jaw and internal injuries, and the 4th had 8 broken ribs. These injuries were what the hospital reported. 1 hit, 1 kill. Once the vet had them loaded, he heads to the police station in town. He gets to the farm gate where he encounters a police car with 2 officers who had responded to his father's call but had waited on the other side of the gate. They may have arrived just after Devet. Devet stops the truck and gets out. The 2 policemen get out of their vehicles and approach Devet. At that time, one of the men in the back of the truck starts saying that Devet attacked them and he was taking them somewhere to kill them. Devet asked the police if they had received his father's call, and if so, what did his father tell them? The cops said all they knew was that they were sent to investigate a disturbance. The police told Devet that they needed to handcuff him and take him to the station for questioning. Devet promptly beat the crap out of both policemen. He left the cops writhing on the ground and called a police officer that he knew. She said she would meet him at the station and get it sorted out. The assailants were put in jail for the night. They would later try to sue Devet civilly, and the case dragged on for some time before it was dismissed. I asked Devet what kind of trouble he got in for assaulting the 2 police officers. He said, "Jesse, You have to understand that in Africa, if a man beats you like I beat them, you never speak of it to anyone. For most of this sort of violence would be a once-in-a-lifetime event. For Devet, it's a common occurrence. The first year I went to visit him, 153 farmers in South Africa had been killed. He was on a hit list. White people wore T-shirts that said, "Don't kill me, I am not a farmer." I'm not kidding you. In both South Africa and Zimbabwe, there was a commercial farmers union. It was called the CFU. I asked Devet what the government was doing about the murder of all these farmers. He said, "Jesse, we, the CFU, went to see them and they said, 'What do you expect?'" It was the new South Africa. In essence, Devet is a vigilante. On a monthly basis, he is chasing down rustlers, defending his sheep herd, or finding out who robbed his chicken outlets. Due to the unreliability of the police, he formed the Green Light Patrol. They were called this because they have a green flashing light on the tops of their vehicles. These were neighbors and farmers who would respond as a posse when a farmer was under attack. Devet lived up to his name. He is, in fact, the law of the region. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.